Unmuted. Can you hear me? Speakers, in the status quo, social movements are plagued by issues which are stopping them from achieving the change that they profess they want to. We're seeing performance activism at an all-time high, where people come in riding the high or positives of the movements, suck away capital from those who actually experience the movements and know what is going on, and burn these movements. We're seeing short bursts of energy. With Black Lives Matter, we see a huge burst of energy focusing on minor concessions that were later turned away, and as it only focuses on the positive, people become complacent, think that it changed, and they move away. It is resulting in a lack of capital to actually cause change in society because people believe more is being done than is actually being done, and it sucks energy from a movement that thinks its job is finished. 2 points in tonight's debate. First of all, how it improves action and movements as a whole, and second of all, looking specifically at intersectionality within a movement. On my first point of improving movements as a whole, this comes under three sort of areas. The first being members, the second being looking specifically at political capital, and the third being looking at the health of the movement in the long term. First of all, in members, I have 4 reasons why it improves improves members within movements and enables them to create more social change. The first is addressing the issues of complacency, the sort of liberals going back to brunch after Biden won and refusing to acknowledge the issues that still maintain in America and that he has continued to not address. And so we would see that the reason this is addressed in our model is because liberals cannot, with these social movements not focusing on the benefit of, for instance, Biden winning, but focusing on the issues of ICE detention still being at an extremely high rate, you are not allowed to sort of believe that your social movement has done what it is needed to do, and and that you need to go back to work. Sort of addressing this complacency of leaving a movement without it actually being done because they focus on victories way too early and way too hard. Secondly, we look at sort of like why negative has sort of a stronger impetus for creating change than positive news. Because obviously, like if you see good news, you have sort of like, you see that there is less impetus to join a movement. You see there's probably less reason to join a movement if it's already succeeding because you don't have a problem to solve. You're not seeing a problem to solve. You're seeing problems being solved. As opposed to this seeing the problems, seeing the issues without sort of this getting flooded with positive images means you have an impetus to change if you care about the issue. And these are the people that are actually joining. So the people that are actually going to join and do the hard work aren't just in there to ride off the highs of good news, would be much stronger. Sort of people within the movement will get much stronger persuaded to keep on going and work harder, and people outside of the movement will get much more impetus to join the movement through seeing bad portrayals rather than good ones. And so, for instance, it's the difference between seeing sort of like solar panels getting set up in an obscure location in sort of like some random town in Canada versus looking at the continuing destruction of the Amazon rainforest. It is more beneficial to see these sort of extremely negative examples rather than the small positive ones that movements latch on too far too early. And so we'd like to see this negative impetus grow movements and grow members. Third of all, looking specifically at performative activism. These sort of people go into movements and suck a lot of political capital away. This is looking at sort of like the black squares with the Black Lives Matter movements, and a lot of these people professing support of the movement, pointing to sort of like all the social, everyone's joined, we've got all these activists joining us, pointing at that as a good thing without actually looking at systemic change, and then leaving, sucking all of this capital out of the movement as they move. These sort of like the frontline people moving away from the movement, taking away all of these benefits, leaving the people who actually care, the people who are actually there to do hard work, who were not given the airtime and oxygen because all of the sort of capital was pulled away to these performative activists. And we see you simply cannot do this. It is resulted in sort of the Black Lives Matter movement losing a lot of steam despite not actually having gained a significant amount of benefits as it would like to. And the fourth reason why is we sort of start to see people left behind. We see that, if movements profess all this optimism, look very optimistic, do not sort of acknowledge the negatives in their world, we see sort of like the people that actually tries to help, this imbalance sort of they see their movement and they see the difference in their material conditions, and they get this material disconnect. They don't believe in their movement anymore because they don't experience the benefit the movement professes in the sort of ratio it professes. It is much too positive and they experience the severe negatives. This happens quite often in the US, where Democrats get in and pat themselves on the back about getting elected, but don't actually perform particularly well in getting policies that help the people they claim to support. And these voters then turn around and don't vote again. And this is very similar for social movements. This happens in climate change. It happens in and other such movements. So that after analysing those issues in society and how they are addressed in members and how they are addressed by negative rather than positive focus, we see that we'll get more members, improving the working power of movements. Onto political capital, we see that, as I said, with members, fear is more persuasive, and we get two benefits from this. We see that it energizes the base more. So rather being sort of like lethargically sort of pursuing more of these like small wins, they actually get the energy to go and combat the big issues, combat the worst issues, because the most pessimistic thing they can put out is obviously the worst issues. So they have the energy to go and pursue these rather than small victories or no victories at all. And second of all, it gives them more capital in wider society. If they can turn around, and if they're not claiming all these benefits, society can't acknowledge that they've been given anything and then can't turn around and refuse to give them more. For instance, this looks like not pointing to Black Lives Matter and saying, oh, you've gotten a few police departments to consider defunding, that's enough. You've had your time in the sun, we're going to move on now. But if they focus on the negative issues, they can point to society and be like, no, we refuse to take this. There is still so much more work to be done. So that is why they get more political capital to actually work as a movement. And lastly, on the health of the movement, creating sort of stronger movement. We see first, this happens for three reasons. First of all, it creates sustained engagement. As I said, with the members and with political capital, it sort of stops these complacencies that we saw in sort of like the rise and fall of Black Lives Matter. And we see that sustained movement, even if you get short bursts of perhaps more productive change, we see that sustained movement is far better because it is able to continually lobby and erode societies in order to create this change. Second of all, it enables the movement. We see that, it enables the movement to move forward more successfully, because we see that future action needs to be sort of like geared around future problems, not around past successes. You can't go ahead and perform the same action and expect to get the same results. You need to focus on the negatives and use that to inform your decision. I'll talk about that a little bit more in intersectionality. And third of all, we see it looks more honest. It stops gaslighting from people against the movement who try to say they're being, who say they're just out there to have their time in the sun and look good, sort of the performative activists. It sort of gives them more moral capital to say that the job isn't done, that we're being brutally honest about the conditions of our people, and that we need to move on. And this strengthens the movement. So impacting, just quickly, obviously, the reason this is all important is because we care about social movements, we care about the sort of things these people try to profess. So at the end of this, we see that we get stronger social movements. Secondly, on intersectionality, we'd like to see that those suffering worst often have the worst statistics. This is pretty obvious. So then obviously from this, we see that if focusing on the negative statistics then gears these movements to then focus on these worst affected members within the movements. We can look specifically with feminism. If feminism focused on its worst affected members, it would focus intersectionality onto sort of like people of color and women of color, rather than focusing on the successes of white women in the developed world. And why is this especially important? Because it will improve strategies overall, because if they can combat the issues of the most affected, it makes it a lot easier, and the movement is a lot better equipped to combat the issues of those who aren't as affected. And so they become a stronger movement as a whole for having to address these more negative issues. And second of all, we would prefer that these movements sort of address the worst affected in their movements and preference them, because they are the most vulnerable and often the most forgotten and often the most left behind when they see their material conditions being separated from, sort of like the performative activism and the backpatting of the head of the movement. So at the end of this, we see that specifically ours helps the worst affected in movements gain the most amount of ability, as opposed to the performative activism of the status quo. For those reasons, I'm proud to affirm.
Great. I thank that speaker for their speech, and when you're ready, invite the first negative speaker to begin their team's case.
Hello, can I be heard?
Yes.
Thank you. Let's do a very simple thought experiment and look at the climate change protests all throughout the world. When the climate change protests or the media surrounding the climate change protests or the climate change social movement was like, well, we got 15,000 people protesting at a square. Did that make people feel like climate change had been solved? And did that make people drop off because they were like, oh, well, no, there's, I guess, no problem anymore and we can all just go home? Or did that make people around the world then be like, oh my God, this is such a cool thing that everyone is doing. I feel supported in my actions and trying to protest. And did that make people actually opt into the climate protest and then cause like the biggest protest, literally just the biggest protest in the whole world the world has probably ever seen? I think the answer is quite clearly the latter, which is why all of their analysis literally goes down the drain after, like, in less than the first minute of my speech, because they are just ahistoric, they are unempirical, and we just want to hear a single example of which social movement that has actually like been successful, that has done all of that stuff, because I just don't think that is how social movements work. Okay, 3 things I'm doing in my speech. First, a bit of setup. Second, I will prove why we get better change on our side. Third, I will show how we like increase participation and we make like well-being better under our side as well. Note all rebuttal will be integrated. Firstly, on setup, 2 things here on setup. The first thing here is how will this likely be communicated, because we didn't get quite a clear picture from Affirmative. We think this is rather like under their side, they're going to communicate things in a rather negative way. And the implicit like thing that you get out of it is that change is almost impossible. Because even if you're like, well, we have to keep on making changes, if the end point of that narrative or if the conclusion of all of that rhetoric is because systems of power are entrenched by the patriarchy, because things are just so difficult, because everyone is so oppressed and they live such difficult lives, the implicit thing you get out of that is, well, it's just so insurmountable, you can't quite overcome it. So that in and of itself like is setting you up to fail. But the second thing is, I think this is likely to be communicated to the movement directly. So of course you're going to like signal it out to lots of people, but the people that are listening most are people that kind of maybe already know the problem and maybe are already aware of it. So the second question under setup here is, what would we actively support? We would support things that focus on change and focus on positive change that we've already made. So note that a lot of their analysis is just like, well, people kind of forget about the problem and then therefore no one attends anymore. That's just like insane. We can of course support, we can always celebrate victories as they come, but also focus on the problem as it is. So for instance, this looks like saying, people are dying in Yemen. However, X amount of dollars can make a change. Look at all these changes that have occurred. And at that point, it's clear that you can support and celebrate changes that have occurred. You can endorse certain charities that have made huge changes in the lives of people without coming at the cost of depicting the problem in its totality. But note the setup that I gave you earlier about how this is communicated to people within the movement, i.e. people that are facing that oppression, right? If you're talking about like Black Lives Matter, I'm pretty sure Black people know about the harms of over-policing. I'm pretty sure they know about the problems that exist. I'm pretty sure they know about how they don't see, they see barely anyone in the House of Reps or in the Senate that looks like them, and how that is a real problem. So it's really unclear why their case was at all strategic in this debate. Clearly, it just is not. So given that setup, onto my first point as to why we get better change under our side. As I said before, we think that people that are likely to actually instigate and make changes in the first place are people that are already oppressed and know about the problem, and people that are aware enough about the problem to try and come fight for it. We think there are certain comparative, probably 5 reasons as to why we think negative narratives are just always worse than positive narratives when you're trying to get people to come out and make changes. The first, and note that this responds implicitly to all the material we gave you, all the material we had from Affirmative, even though all of that material was just like, well, people forget about the problem and have already empirically disproved that. So the first reason why we think positive narratives are just better comparatively than negative narratives is because when you have positive narratives, you are reminded of your power in a way that you are not when you are told that there is an insurmountability to your struggle. So that is to say, under their side, they forget that power. Under their side, when they're told that systems are too powerful and the judiciary is stacked, you will not get human rights lawyers that try to advocate for changes for Indigenous deaths in custody. You do not get people that try to take down corporations because they're so large, because they opt out of it in the first place, because they think it's insurmountable. They think their structures are too strong. Similarly here, imagine if World Vision was just like, well, there is poverty and people are so sad and it's just all so shitty. If you are reminded of the change that you could make, or reminded of the change that people have made in the past, you are less likely to donate because you don't think that money is going anywhere strong. In the same way, we think that Democrats only come out to vote when they think they're going to win, not when they think they're going to lose. The same principle obviously applies in here in terms of galvanization. But secondly, I think positive statistics show investors of social movements that like the social movement is super lucrative and that they should therefore invest. So if they wanted to talk about capital, we just get way more capital under our side. When investors look at ANZ having supported various funds, various causes and various charities, and looking at how that concretely has bettered so many people, social investment gets better under our side, and that captures the biggest and richest and wealthiest people in society, obviously a huge benefit there. Thirdly, though, we think under our side, you are far more likely to like do things that are less self-interested because you feel like the end goal of your actions like actually matters, right? So if you like, so maybe under our side, because you're like, well, we can stop climate change, you'll be like, well, let me do my part to it. Let me take the train to Melbourne instead of taking a flight. But if you feel like climate change is an inevitability, which is what you were reminded of under their side when you have stats about rising sea levels, or when you have stats about how everything's bad, and when you have stats about how Donald Trump managed to repeal like so many environmental legislations, that probably doesn't happen. You probably take the flight because it's like, fuck it, who cares? And then they wanted to talk about intersectionalism and how that got benefited. We think actually intersectionalism gets far better under our side because we think that we actually capture non-Western actors way more than they do. That is to say, when social movements can be shown to be successful, when businesses can say we employ women and women can be really smart and they can contribute value to our business, you get like businesses in India or businesses in Africa far more likely to employ those women because you are actually celebrating the successes of that. Obviously, though, if the narrative is just, well, women are oppressed and oh my gosh, they're so terrible, no like business is going to employ those women because basically like patriarchal societies just agree with like suppressing women anyway, unless it is advantageous for them to like liberate them. And we think when you show the benefits of liberation under our side and show those meaningful contributions, we just get to like unlock more social movements in those areas as well. The next reason why we think and lastly, of course, we think that people are galvanized by momentum and are far more likely to make changes. They say, well, this was bad because politicians will now pat themselves on the back. But that's actually a point for our case, because we think that if politicians feel like, think about it, if the Liberal Party is like, oh, everyone's clapping us on the back because we got through like the gay marriage plebiscite, and now we're gonna like, and everyone's super happy, that incentivizes them to make more change and pander to the same cause because that is something that is seen as electorally favorable. So actually, politicians like patting themselves on the back is a good thing because it incentivizes political capital and makes us better. That's why we're far more likely to get more change. Obviously, the most important thing in this debate is we like liberate the most oppressed people. Secondly, and very quickly, on why we improve participation and well-being. We think that we would always prefer a movement that empowers people and makes them feel happy. Why do we empower people under our side? Firstly, people are just like reminded of things that they can be happy for. And note that even like victims often self-opt into or have a revealed preference for feeling happy. That's why we have movies like Selma. That's why we have movies like The Butler that remind people of the changes that have been made. But secondly, I think people like, so that means that people want to celebrate those successes. But secondly, I think that when you are happier, you're far more resilient against conservatives. You're far more resilient against people that are trying to tear you down. And that makes you feel far better. We think if the trade-off here was having more money as an African-American person but feeling shittier, or feeling empowered to be Black and feeling like you have a community, we would always support that even if we didn't get change, but we showed you why we did. Very proud to oppose.
I thank that speaker for their speech and invite the second affirmative to continue their team's case.
Speakers, the opposition painted our case as a world in which social movements constantly put down their own members, a world in which social movements did not ever recognize like any successes, a move where like every single success is going to be just like put down as like, oh, there's no hope for the future, like climate change is inevitable, it's time to give up. That is not the world we stand for in tonight's debate. What we think these pessimistic social movements are going to look like is an attitude change, a change where they go, okay, we got this victory, that's good. We can't give up now. There is work to be done. Look at all the neglected sections of like our society that like we need to focus on more. Like, okay, we've got this like advancement for the gender pay gap, but we have been neglecting like the rights of intersectional women in the feminist movement, right? That is what we think these movements look tonight. And we think it was disingenuous of the opposition to characterize them as like they have, right? Two main issues in tonight's debate with substantive integrated. Firstly, on basically how this will affect the effectiveness of social movements, and secondly, looking at like the impacts on like intersectional people, because we felt they were like a particularly important stakeholder in tonight's debate, right? So the first sub question on like how does this improve social movements is like, what is the impact on the members of those who are in social movements? So the first thing they tell you is that social movements being pessimistic sends a message that change is impossible and it's not even worth trying, right? It's hard to galvanize a movement when you're telling them like all hope is lost, right? So there are a few responses to this. Firstly, basically, our mechanism here wasn't that, you know, climate change is inevitable, let's do as much as we can. The mechanism here was that we're placing a bigger impetus that things need to be changed, right? So what we thought was missing from the example of the climate strikes, right, was like the outcomes. Sure, like the whole world like had like a little movement, but what outcomes were actually achieved? Like what tangible global change resulted from that, rather than everyone just going, hey, look how many people are out on the streets, right? That is being too optimistic and completely missing the purpose of that movement, right? We think if you're being pessimistic, though, you need climate action to like point to the things that need to be changed and then get that action, right? The second response here is after like a little victory, this is what I alluded to in my intro, it's important to then send a message that there's still reform that needs to be done. It is not okay to like lay your feet back. Now, the opposition told us that like people aren't just going to forget about these issues. That's not what we said. We think it's quite easy and like quite common when it comes to social movements where people after like a big victory become like complacent. Now, that's not forgetting about the issue. That's assuming that a large majority of the issue has been solved. That's an important distinction that the opposition missed in our case, right? And basically what we think is important there is it means that people aren't just forgetting that police officers in America shoot like African Americans. What they're thinking is that all these states made wonderful, optimistic promises that they're going to defund the police force. And so they've like stopped like pressing this as an issue, when in fact, most of them have just gone back to their basic police model, right? So that was a massive harm in tonight's debate. The third thing to say is that change is much harder when your opposition is able to use your celebrations to reduce political capital. So what do I mean by this? My first speaker alluded to it, but I'll expand on it a little more. Basically, it means that when you use these celebrations, so basically, even if you don't believe that people become complacent, right? The alternative mechanism for people, for the social movements dying out, is that the opposition to these social movements point to the change that has occurred, point to the celebrations that are occurring, and saying, look, you've done enough, like it's going to be too more expensive to go further, or it's too radical to go further, you know? We see this as like common rhetoric in like the Republican Party in America. So at the end of that, we thought that like the message we were sending was not that change was impossible, but that change needs to be continually sought and encouraged, right? So at the end of that, we thought social movement members were likely to like still like show up. We thought that pessimism wouldn't push people away. But it's also important to note we gave you several other mechanisms. We told you performance activism people would be like cut out. We told you that people who under the status quo are left behind because they disconnect with the false hope that they're given and the like empty promises that aren't fulfilled are left behind, will no longer be left behind because their struggles are being recognized by the movement as a whole. And the third thing is Actually, the third thing is what we told you earlier. Anyway, so there were two other legs of that argument that weren't rebutted by the opposition at all. So we have to assume that social movement members would be still very involved, if not more involved. So the next sub-question here is, how does this impact the ability of social movements to achieve change, right? The main thing they told us here, they gave us the example of the global climate protests and how optimistic that was and how great everyone was out. I've already rebutted this. Basically, it's just an example for our case. Lots of people got really optimistic. It like showed everyone was super happy that everyone is out, but no change came from it, right? Substantial change that was recognized, and the movement has like not been as strong as those strikes, right? The second thing they told you is that when the government is celebrated, they'll like push through more reform, which is like a really good mechanism, right? So firstly, that's not really true when the movement is not the wider public. So for example, we don't think like Black Lives Matter represents like all of America and thus like has massive influence over the policies of the government. We think that like when they celebrate, that isn't a sign to the government that they have done a good job. That's a sign that the movement has like had a victory. And that's often like the point where the government is like, oh, look, they're celebrating. We don't really need to do more. They're happy, right? The next thing is, the point I alluded to before about how political capital works against. The final thing they tell us is that hope is like far stronger than pessimism to get change. A few responses here. People use optimism to reduce political capital. I've already mentioned that. Second, fear is a far more direct mechanism as a way to interact and grab people like on a personal level to get them to change. Frustration with empty optimistic promises turns people away from the movement. And finally, small wins can lead to like complacency and not like actual change. So basically at the end of that, we didn't think hope or like optimism was a really good way to get change, a mechanism, versus like pessimism. I have a little bit of substantive here. How would this impact the conservative social movement? So if it can prove that this policy leads to a less combative and destabilizing conservative movement, then we can win the debate because we can stabilize political discourse, we can get more engagement, get less politicization and polarization and stuff like that, right? We think there are three ways we do this. We reduce harmful rhetoric, we encourage critical evaluation of your own movement, and we expose people to troubling stats about like the side that they're supporting, right? Now, the obvious response here is that pessimism means that there will be a continued harmful like rhetoric from these sides, and we have three responses. Firstly, stats with counter common rhetoric will like make this rhetoric less effective. Secondly, people are encouraged to view movements critically. And finally, racist people will still be racist. The people we saved are the people who are uninformed to the racist parts of the movement. So at the end, we thought the movement was far more effective and was able to address the conservative issue in politics right now. And therefore, we were able to like get much more improvement through a pessimistic model. So at the end of that, we thought that was the most like a really significant part of the debate. And since we got more change, we won the debate. But secondly, and it's like admittedly a smaller issue, who best helps the most vulnerable stakeholders? Sorry, let me clarify. By smaller, I mean smaller in the fact that they haven't addressed it as much, not smaller in relevant of the debate. Note that this is important because these are the most important like stakeholders, right? Because they are vulnerable and they're being failed by these movements. So therefore, if the opposition fails to disprove any harms or fails to prove any benefits for these people, then we feel we win the debate because we provide the best benefits. The only thing they tell us is that like celebrating successes of social movements will lead to like businesses employing women because it's more socially acceptable. Two responses. Firstly, we think when you provide like an option for a company, that's far less that's going to be a far less ability to get change when you compare to like actual pressure and actual scrutiny on these companies. We think when you give someone an incentive and a pressure to do something, it's going to happen far more often than when you just give them the option to do something. And the second response is that actually doesn't address the root causes of the issues, which means I'm very proud to affirm.
I thank that speaker for their speech, and I invite the second negative to continue their team's case.
Hello, can I be heard?
Yep.
think the opposition is a little bit confused because they keep going up and being like, oh, you're lying about celebrating your successes. But I'm like, what? Like, these movements presumably do have a degree of success to celebrate. If they did not, presumably they would not be celebrating, because that makes no sense. And the opposition really gives no arguments to presume that they would be celebrating without any degrees of successes. I think it's very obvious why they would not. Some of the harms they point out, like the gaslighting, etc. But it just seems unclear that movements would ever do that because it seems counterproductive in lots of reasons. It seems like movements would just want to celebrate the successes they actually did have. It seems unlikely that they would overemphasize or fabricate successes in general. I think that they did not understand this. That actually means that most of their harms make very little sense in this debate. What are the actual three things that matter in this debate? First thing that matters is how specifically this message is communicated, because I don't think it's communicated anywhere near as lovely as the opposition wants it to be. Second thing that matters is the participation and the energy of these movements in general. And note that this is two parts. Firstly, just like how people feel when they are part of that movement or the movement seeks to represent them. And secondly, about the general like participation and strength of the movements. And finally, on just like the capacity for change in general throughout society. Note that on the first thing then on how this message is communicated. Note that I think it is incredibly difficult for the message to be communicated in a way that is unified. Reasons are three. Firstly, counter movements exist which will consistently seek to undermine and like give a message that prevails that. But I think secondly, perhaps more importantly here, they will actually try to appeal to certain facts of just like, these are the successes that you have achieved. These are the things that you did. And note that those things are like the real statistics, right? And note that to the extent that you are pessimistic of those statistics, you just come across like you're lying, and you come across like you're attempting to mislead people about how significant the problem actually is in the world. Note here that this is particularly problematic because it is particularly confusing to lots of people that like experience that problem, and they're now just like, why are these people like trying to underestimate certain successes? But secondly, it just like seems to a degree malicious or like surreptitious to the extent that you're not telling the full truth of successes and you're not like explaining things properly. But I think most importantly here, it is just a great excuse to sort of rationalize why that problem does not exist in the world, to say like all these social movements are actually just overestimating the amount of the problem by sort of reducing these sorts of impacts that their change has in the world. The second thing to note is that the communication is just likely to be mixed. The reasons are threefold. First thing is that you just only have so much capital. You're never going to reach like a huge number of groups that are particularly uninformed. Secondly, it is just a deeply counterintuitive message to be pessimistic for celebration. Like people want to say this is a success and I should be happy. Unclear that that is likely to be like particularly resonant. But thirdly, it's just like historically we have always celebrated the successes that movements have. And this seems like a substantial drift away from that. It seems like that would be hard for people to adjust to. Note that how bad this is for the opposition, because it just means that this is particularly unappealing. And it means that you just have like less cohesion about the sorts of like changes that your social movement wants to have of the direction of your movement in general. And finally, I just think you have way less capacity to mobilize your entire movement as a whole, to the extent that people are there for different reasons. They have different beliefs about where the movement sits. The third thing to note under this is that it's really easy under our side to actually distinguish between a problem and a success. The reasons are really simple. First, they are fundamentally different things. You can say poverty is a huge problem, but here's how $1 can help poverty by an enormous amount. The second thing is that successes are obviously limited. Everyone knows that their $1 is not going to solve poverty. They know that poverty will continue even if there are successes in the world. And thirdly, just like where there is a problem, like people are genuinely honest about it, like relative to the successes. And I think the last thing here is that to an extent, success like sort of renews capital to sort of like fix the existing problem that is there. That is to say, if you have enormous amounts of success, say like feminist rights, then all of a sudden it becomes a lot easier to fix the remaining problem of the like small group of women that still suffer those sorts of things that the vast majority of other people have now received benefits or access to. Note here that I think it's like the opposition's arguments on gaslighting really make little sense here, because it seems like social movements are the most sensitive group in the entire world of the issue, like the worst stuff underneath their movements. Seems deeply unclear why they would ever do that, or how like celebrating successes in fact like does that to that extent. The fourth and final thing here is the opposition makes a very big concession at second by saying, look, I guess we would still celebrate to some extent because he knows that celebration is just obvious and important to people. But note how bad this idea of just like, oh, we can celebrate a little bit, but don't be complacent is, because firstly, I don't think it fulfills their requirements of the topic. But more importantly, this really impacts my argument here on clouding the messaging. And this, I think, is the precise problem of their entire case. Secondly, then, on how else we win the debate, I think we just improve the energy of the movement. First and most important thing to note here is that you literally make people feel worse. And note the three emotions the opposition wanted to instill in people, things like guilt, things like anger or fear, or things like anxiety that the sorts of progress you've made is going to revert. And literally note that is how these individuals have felt their entire lives, how society has flooded them with this sort of negative emotion. And I ask you, if that is truly what you want these people to feel, surely you are no better than the repressors of these people in the first place. We tell you social movements ought never stand for those things. Secondly here, I just think you get far more involvement and energy in general in your movement. The reasons are twofold. Firstly, individuals have just a sheer desire to celebrate. Threefold reasons why that's true, that just like their life is typically bad and have been repressed substantially. Secondly, because they're often young, have a lot of motivation and energy to try and make a change and achieve successes in the world. But thirdly, because they have often expended great effort to achieve a degree of change, and they want a sense of satisfaction that they've made a difference to the world. Note that the opposition's arguments I've already responded to here on empty promises mean that that is particularly unlikely. But even if it is true here that there is a degree of empty promise, or there is a degree of like you're overestimating the successes, etc. Note that that still has an enormous range of benefits in terms of the appeal of your movement in general, but also like literally makes these people feel so much better about their lives. It is unclear why the people that have so much sadness in their life or not be able to be a little bit over-optimistic about the world. The fourth and final thing here, which literally got no response, is simply to say that we capture an enormous amount of non-Western actors through things like role modeling, through things like literally like explaining how we got a degree of success, the knowledge and understanding of how we did that. And finally, just on like a sense of like they're missing out on achieving those successes and improvements in the world as well. It seems like we just got an enormous surge in the developing world, as we've seen, of literally like all sorts of women's rights, etc. That was a benefit that literally won the debate on its own as well. Final thing then is on the capacity to change in general. Opposition runs the three arguments under why they get better long-term change. The first is a sense of complacency, but note that it is deeply not in the interest of these social movements to be complacent, to the extent that the problem will always exist to some degree, and to the extent that their own constituents will like recognize a degree of problem, literally due to their own mechanisms. And it just like seriously feels illogical. Like the BLM movement does not feel complacent, like it's achieved a great extent, right? Like all of that anger and that sense of energy still is there and exists. So it's unclear that complacency actually dissipates energy. The second argument is just like a degree of fatigue. But note that fatigue in this case is actually particularly short term. And that is why we think it is particularly likely that you'll have a burst now, you'll have increasingly big bursts as we go along. That is due to short-term fatigue, but that doesn't mean you like leave the movement because you're like really out of energy. No, it means you return even stronger the next time, garnering more and more support as you go along. That is realistically how we get long-term change. The last argument that they give is just like, oh, celebration of one issue sort of like clouds the other problems in society. Like, note that celebration is deeply personal. It's unclear whether you ought like care about all the problems in the world when you can celebrate the problems, the successes on the problems you care about. But secondly, like you just can't spend your entire life fixating on problems. At that point, it becomes like particularly meaningless. Note here, oh, I'm out of time, but note that there is a set of benefits that Aman gives you on social investments that was not responded to. That is how we actually get better change in this debate.
I thank that speaker for their speech, and I now invite the third affirmative to conclude their case.
The opposition's comparative is that negatives can still be represented on their side. We have three responses. The first is that's not what's represented currently isn't realism. It's biased towards optimism, and it disproportionately doesn't represent things which are happening, which are negative. That's for four reasons. The first is that there is privilege within the movement, which is a point we make from first affirmative and receives zero response throughout this debate. Green movements can talk about how, like, for example, France has moved to nuclear energy. They do not talk about the deadly effects that happen in the developing world. A white woman can say, I have the lawyers to be able to like crack down on sexual harassment. You do not look at other people who in that intersectional movement who have more negative experiences with that. Second, we say people should have a tendency towards optimism, and that's literally for the reason they concede, which is that people are sad when they see things which are pessimistic. That means movement, but also the mechanism here is that movements can publicize maybe positive and negative things, but it's what's shared through social media, which is actually how this operates. So if you see something which is good, you love heart react it. If you see something which is bad, you don't want to share it because you don't want your friends to think you are a downer. Third, this directly contradicts narratives because if you say things are good and bad, social movements are discouraged to do that because it makes them seem as if they're presenting things which are inconsistent, but also some of those bad things will directly contradict the good progress they've made. But fourth, this negative thing, these negative attention under their side necessarily looks like things like, for example, cancel culture or looking at specific people because you will just choose the most palliative negative things to look at. Whereas under our side, you have to look at everything because publishing statistics about why you aren't succeeding means you have to look at the underlying and root causes. The second response here is that positive things are actively harmful because showing something which is positive is actively harmful. And that's for the same reason that, for example, you believe your friend will recover from illness. You believe your favorite team will win the game. You believe you'll pass the exam. You believe you and your friends are good people. You believe climate change will be fixed and it won't affect you, and you're happy to put off the problem for as long as possible. The only way to shatter that perception is through negative things. But thirdly, they have not been meaningfully comparative either, because under their side, the way that negative news gets out there is through things like the actual news or through like tangibly feeling the fact that this is the hottest summer on record, or your friend who was sexually harassed has not been able to get redress. That means it's deeply unclear why the negatives which come out on their side, which do not come from the social movement, will not be much more harmful and give people a sense of betrayal. They cannot simply claim that on our side, for example, negative things will still come out and we can't, like negative things will still occur and they can still claim all our benefits. And that means they have to defend pure optimism versus something which is much more, versus pure negatives, pessimism. 3 questions in the speech then. First, how will this generate political capital and will for change? We claim an immediate and crucial benefit, which is largely unresponded, which is that those who are apathetic or believe the issues are already solved will be shocked out of that. And they have no response except to say, this is an ahistoric claim. For example, look at the climate change march. But I think this perfectly illustrates what we're talking about. You get a climate change march every 6 months and you go out into the streets. What needs to happen to change climate change is you need to vote to make sure that you put people in power who do not actually support policies which ruin the environment. The only way you get that is by focusing on the underlying issues. Then we give the important context then that this is the majority of people because first, social outrage, as I've already mentioned, is proliferated through social media. People's attention spans are short. And so the vast majority of people aren't hardcore fans of that movement. They just apathetically think everything is solved. And we give a claim which says that we motivate these people. We motivate them more. But also we also provide a claim which is that we sustain their engagement because we get the public support, like sprees of donations which they want to claim, or opening up discourse about controversial things and slowly pushing discourse to be more acceptable about how bad men actually are, for example, or how bad the climate change actually is, because we bring more attention to that immediately and people do not think the issue is going to be okay. That was an enormous unrebutted benefit. Now let's talk more broadly about which was more powerful, fear or hope, contrasting either side. They think if you show benefits, you are able to, they say if you show benefits, you are able to inspire people. But I think even in their best case, they lose the debate here because the second neg says these movements have successes. The success of this movement is not changing, for Black Lives Matter, is not changing the amount of police violence which occurs. For Me Too, it is not meaningfully reforming sexual assault. And for climate change, it is not, for example, stopping oil companies from buying out politicians. If it's negative, we tell you you necessarily have to talk about those issues because your reporting will be on $500 million went from oil companies in political donations this year. This is why we can't solve that issue, which means people are more likely to actually vote. The successes they're talking about are like, for example, France went green with their energy, which isn't going to do much. The next thing they give us at second negative is just that the messages are mixed. But I think this ignores the important context of this debate. Deep down, people know, for example, like an issue with climate change, things are getting worse. It didn't exist in the past. They're pessimistic. They think things are going to fail. And police violence is literally getting worse and more public as more examples of it are recorded. That's why I think people understand these underlying reasons and the pessimism that we promote is actually true, and they're less likely to react against it or believe it isn't convincing. Their response then is just, this is so insurmountable that you're going to give up. Firstly, as I've mentioned, we already prefer that even if you have less effort, that effort is directed towards something which will actually claim a benefit. But second of all, maybe we concede it's emotionally draining to be pessimistic all the time. But first, people want to fight more for it because they know it's a bigger reward. But second, fear is a much more, like, if you want to be hopeful, that also requires a huge amount of emotional buy-in. You have to believe something is true, and you have to work yourself up for 6 months to think that this will occur. Fear is just something that stays with you and influences every action you make. We don't believe that's more effort, for example. But third, they don't say how. Third, they don't say why we can't, like, for example, present a negative issue and then also say what we can do to fix it. So we will report things which are negative, but then we will say the reason how this could be made better or how we can enforce change is, for example, by like lobbying the government or voting. And that still has a bit of optimism within it, because we're saying you just need to take this action. Things right now are bad, but they can get better if we do these specific things. They never showed why we couldn't do that. The last thing they say then is you have more actual money and investment into these movements first. Why would a corporation invest into a movement which is about empowering people to take suits against other people in the workplace, like sexual harassment? Or why would a company want to do something which is about preventing the environment from getting further degraded? Corporations are not the people who give money to social movements. Their aims are literally contradictory. That makes zero sense. What we've proven at the end of this then is that we aspire more frequent change. We have a more compelling kind of social rhetoric alongside us. And also we have change about key issues which actually matter. And even if you believe, for example, that there will be some amount of pessimism or emotionally draining, and optimism is good to some extent, you must weigh that against how we get more frequent change and how we actually get change which is directed to the things which matter. The second question then is about intersectional and vulnerable groups. And if we claim this benefit, I think we do win the debate, because they were the most vulnerable people. They also existed in the developing world, were the most numerous, as the opposition concede, and they were the least likely to be heard. They give this really strange analysis to prove their point here, which is that social movements are more successful and so they're more inclusive. For example, corporations will now want to be involved with developing nations. Obviously, that wasn't true because Western companies were the biggest enemies of developing nations and had ripped them off for a while. But then they just say, well, at least in the developed world, we have role models and successful examples that developing nation movements can draw from. They can still research what worked or what was successful in that specifically. Also, don't be discouraged. It means that you only see successful reporting which comes from developed nations. They will think it can't apply to them. They can always just look at how the movement functions by itself. Our argument was that negative reporting will always focus more on the people who are worse off, and because the people who are the worse off are the people we most care about, and as they say, are the people who are most important in this debate, because of the argument of privilege, which means that optimism tends towards people who are already advantaged. That was why we claimed the biggest benefit for the biggest group in this debate, and that's why I'm proud to affirm.
I thank that speaker for their speech, and I now invite the third negative to conclude the debate.
I'm not quite sure that the opposition realises in this debate what exactly it is like to feel helpless, what exactly it is like to live or to think that there is nothing you can do, and how in a life like that or in a situation like that, what can make someone feel better than anything else is being with other people who are trying to change it and trying to fix it, and knowing that maybe your life has a purpose because you can attempt to do that too. Because what the opposition is telling you in this debate is that people who are already oppressed or people who are harmed most by particular issues whose social movements are trying to help, these people who always have to live with their harms that come with their situation, who have no ability to opt out, should continue to live with that hope and live with that celebration, whereas other people can choose to not engage with the movement at all so they don't feel this hopelessness. This is oppression because it pushes the burden of feeling this pain on that particular group. On our side, what is different is that they are allowed to feel hope. They are allowed to clap themselves on the back for the hard work they do every now and again. They are allowed to have parties, and they are allowed to know that there is a potential for change in the future. Two things in this speech: firstly, on how people engage with social movements, and secondly, on why leading to get better change. But before this, I think we just need to clarify that the current bias in social movements is one that is towards pessimism anyway, and that's because often the forces already seem quite strong that we have to battle in order to get change. That is why it is so important, and that is why it is like empirically the key goal of movements at the moment, to try and make people as happy as possible by trying to get them to celebrate, because this like creates some level of hope in a situation that is already fairly like pessimistic. So when they tell you that this is about making promises that won't be fulfilled, that is such a straw man, because that is not what the status quo is. The status quo is that you celebrate victories where you can get them, not that you make them up, which obviously we would never support. So at the end of this, we are not like, what we are talking about is not saying, oh, everything is good when it isn't. It's saying everything is not good at the moment, but it definitely can be good if we collect and we work for it together. Okay, so how do people engage with social movements? Their strategy to win here was by showing us that people sign up during victories and then drop out afterwards, and that they only stand up for the most obvious issues. They have to not only prove that these are true, but also that it is but that the comparative is better, prove why both those things are wrong. So firstly, why this is actually just untrue. The first reason for this is momentum. For example, if, for example, you have achieved something successfully, you probably feel like, oh, maybe that's a good way to spend my money because it is actually being used in a way that makes an impact. But secondly, you also feel like, oh my God, I've done something good. I feel empowered, and like I continue doing good things to the movement. It also just gives you an endorphin rush, which probably makes you happy and more likely to want to support something, as opposed to giving $10 and then saying, oh, look, like, we're sorry, like, it just didn't help. There's still this problem. And you being like, oh, well, I'm not going to do that again. So, but thirdly, also, then like the next success comes, because after you have achieved one success, there will always be another one where you can, if we're allowed to celebrate it, that is, where you can hop back, where you can get back involved in that and be part of that as well. But fourthly, also, we think it is just likely that people within these movements know about the problems that exist. For example, if you are like a supporter of the closing the gap, you probably know about things like abuse of Indigenous Australians in prisons, because that is just very sort of general knowledge. And if you don't know about that, you're probably in the group that's not going to be captured by these movements in any world at all. And it's important to realize that even if it is true that people just sign up when there is a burst of energy, the momentum of that is huge, because when there are these bursts of energy, that's when we actually get things like policy change and actually make changes, and the government can see that people care. So that is not a small benefit in this debate by any means at all. So why, if they don't continue with the movement and they just stay for the the exciting, fulfilling bit, do we still win? That's for three reasons. Firstly, because when they sign up for something, that means that they acknowledge the movement, they'll learn something from that process of success, and then they will have develop some sort of understanding about that and their behavior. For example, even just being celebrating the plebiscite in Australia, after that, you might change the way you treat the queer people in your life, and you might try and understand their lives better, even if you don't actively support their movement. That makes a change to the people in your life and how they're treated. But secondly, it means you're more likely to come back next time, and I already explained the huge impact of that. But thirdly, it might mean that it definitely means that you're more exposed to other issues which you might not know about it. For example, if you don't know about abuse of Indigenous Australians in prisons, then maybe that's something you find out about by joining onto the campaign, and that is something you at least know about and are interested in the future. That impact is huge. So what's important to acknowledge is that we uniquely capture the apathetic people in this debate who are outside of the movement, and we bring them in, even if they're the amount of effort they put into the movement, the amount of work they put into the movement is not huge. That is better than comparative. So some other reasons why it's much better than comparative. On their side, it is not clear why anyone pays attention to the roots, like sources of the problem, or like the root causes they want you to tell you was true, because probably, like it seems like intuitive that the movement would still support the same things, but use this form of pessimistic communication to try and get other people on board. It wasn't true that they will suddenly like change up the support, and probably it is true that movements are more likely to support attainable things, because obviously once you achieve something attainable, you can then move on to the next thing that seems like a logical way to go about things. But secondly, also, people turn away from sad, like because something makes them feel sad and it makes them feel guilty. That's not necessarily a bad thing, because we don't think people have to feel sad and guilty, and that is why we'd prefer a movement that didn't make them feel sad and guilty. And if that hurts your mental well-being and you like choose to have out of it because of that, that's okay. But it just means that all the other people in the movement who now don't get to celebrate and have to live with that every day, their well-being is far, far worse. So we get more and better sustained participation in the movement. Secondly, now, why is this change better from other sources? So firstly, what sort of social movement do we prefer in general? We thought that it was unethical to have this sort of, pessimistic social movement because firstly, it was a form of oppression, as I said, but secondly, also it makes people anxious and unhappy. That's particularly true when the change you're trying to create is very, very long-term and you have to keep chipping away at it. For example, things like law reform or things like climate change, these are not things that are solved overnight, and you need hope to sustain your work, particularly if you are someone like an organizer, or particularly if you're a member of that group. Otherwise, you will literally just give up and be sad. But also, we get better capital investment because companies invest. They tell us no because they don't want to support labour rights. Well, surely they also just support other movements that aren't labour rights. In our worst case, for example, like they often get on board things like women's rights and climate change and stuff like that, which is good. But secondly, also, we have personal investors who give a lot of money to these causes and support them. Then politicians will obviously support causes that make them look good and make them successful. The next thing to say here is that in non-Western countries, material that they really did not respond to, they told us that these people would not think that the success in Western countries is comparable. It doesn't have to be comparable, because as long as they can see that something has worked in Western countries, that is where movements in developing countries are able to start up. Just by like numbers, we win on this argument alone, because they can't prove any change to that part of the world. For all these reasons, we win this debate.
Thank you very much to that speaker for their speech, and to everyone in this debate. The panel will now, I think, go to a breakout room where we'll sort out the result, and we'll be back with you shortly. Thank you so much.